Okay, so we're skipping ahead a little bit in the textbook to the learning modules. These are really important concepts that are so basic to psychology that I think that we'll take a little bit of a break from studying the brain and neurotransmitters and all the biological stuff, talk about some core concepts that then can help you in learning and then getting into memory next week. And then maybe you can apply what you learned about learning and memory to doing well in the rest of the class and all of your other classes. And then we'll come back again to more of the physiological processes and get into consciousness and sleep and more stuff about drugs. Right? Everybody always likes talking about drugs. It's really interesting. Okay, so, what is learning? I mean, this term is used on a daily basis. We are constantly learning. We have to give it an operational definition. It's when some change has occurred and it's relatively permanent. So we're not talking about, something that happens and you spit the information back out and then you forget it right away. Maybe you've recited it enough in your mind to in time to get a pen to write down someone's phone number or punch it into your cell phone. That's not really learning, right? That's some rote recitation, maybe some use of short-term memory, but you're not truly learning. For learning to really occur, it has to be relatively permanent change. And we actually do see a structural change going on in the brain. And we'll get into that next week when we're talking about memory. But you can learn from direct instruction, right? So if someone is teaching you something, you're listening, you're practicing, it's real intentional. Other times, you're just learning from watching other people, or you're learning through your own experiences. So your textbook and all introductory psychology textbooks are going to categorize it by 3 different types. We've got classical conditioning, and classical conditioning started with Ivan Pavlov, and we'll talk about his classic studies with the Pavlov's dogs. But then really it was the American psychologist John B. Watson who applied classical conditioning to human behavior. We have operant conditioning, which we usually think of B.F. Skinner, the Harvard psychologist who trained rats and pigeons to run mazes and push levers in their cages to receive food. But really, operant conditioning was first started by Edward Thorndike, and we'll talk a little bit about his studies. And then lastly, we have observational learning. And observational learning is learning from watching. You have a model exhibiting some kind of behavior, and you copy it. You watch, you pay attention, you copy, you practice, and then you can perform it yourself. And our psychologist here that we're talking about is Albert Bandura, and he was a social cognitive theorist. Your assignment that is due before the next class is on observational learning, and in particular this question of viewing media violence and then acting out aggressively. Do people who watch violent media, either through television or playing video games or listening to violent lyrics in their music, do they then copy it and act it out and become aggressive? And so that's the question. It's been a research question for over 30 years now in psychology. And you can imagine how much it's evolved, considering how much media has evolved over the course of 30 years. So those are different basic types of learning, but they all operate under this same principle that we learn by creating associations. So either things are occurring in time and space together and you go, oh, aha, and you get it, or you are getting rewards for doing something, and so then you learn, ooh, I'm going to do that behavior again because I'm getting something out of it. I understand the consequence. Or you're watching something and you see some kind of result and you copy it. So it doesn't matter what any of the three types, they all have to do with associating things together. All right, so let's talk about classical conditioning. This is where we're saying two things occur in time and space together, and you start to figure out, oh, when there's a flash of lightning, within a couple of seconds, there's going to be a big boom of thunder. And I've learned this through my experience and figuring out that when there's lightning comes thunder. It's like learning really quickly, almost automatically. You don't have to be taught these things. You just observe them and absorb it. The learning takes place and it occurs. So Ivan Pavlov was the one that termed this classical conditioning, and he discovered it when he was studying the digestion in dogs. He was not a psychologist. He was not even interested in human behavior per se. He was interested in human physiology and anatomy because he was a doctor, but he was interested in these biological processes and these physiological responses, and he had his dogs hooked up to had a little test tube hooked up to the cheek of the dog, and he was measuring how quickly they would salivate as they started the digestion process. So all of you who have studied basic biology and you know how digestion works, it begins in the mouth. You salivate to break down food, your mandible moves up and down, and we have these wonderful canines that break down the food. That's all part of the digestive system. And so that's what he was studying, and that's what he was interested in. So he gets his dogs all hooked up. He thought it was a great experiment because he could directly measure how much spittle would fill up in their little test tube and how long that stage of digestion lasted. Well, after doing it for not very long, I mean probably only a matter of a few days, he noticed that they would be filling up their test tubes before they were eating the food. And he was like, they're messing up the experiment. My dogs are messing up the experiment. How can they possibly already be having this response of digestion when they have no food in their mouth yet? That's not supposed to happen until the food hits the tongue. And so he tried to, eliminate these distractors, like, oh, well, maybe they know food is coming, so he would hide the food. But then they would hear his footsteps, and they'd start filling up their little spittle tubes just hearing him walk in the room. And eventually he kind of realized, oh, well, wait a second. They've learned that I represent the food, and so they're anticipating getting fed, and they're already having a physiological response before the food is even presented in their mouth. So he kind of shifted his experiment from that point, and it became a learning experiment. So, but dogs are clever, right? Dogs can be taught tricks. We tend to sort of see things in our dogs maybe a little bit more than what they're really capable of doing. But they really can be trained, and you can elicit these responses from them, but it's kind of unbeknownst to themselves, right? They're not really, how do you have control of your salivary glands? It's just sort of happening. It's unwittingly happening all the time. So we unwittingly learn things all the time as well. Like the whole lightning and thunder. I mean, maybe somebody told that to you when you were 4 years old and you're hiding under your blanket in your bedroom when there's a thunderstorm. But there's a chance that you just naturally figured it out because these events occurred in time and space together. And so you figured it out. You've just learned it. And that's what classical conditioning is. And I'll show the video of Dwight in a second. But kind of going back to Pavlov's dogs. So unconditioned stimulus. Unconditioned means unlearned. This is the naturally occurring stimulus. So for the dogs, the naturally occurring stimulus is going to be the food on the tongue. The food is going to stimulate a response. And so that's the unconditioned response. This is just what's the normal process, what's naturally happening. So what's the normal response to food on the tongue? Salivating, right? So that's the normal physiological response. Unconditioned stimulus, food, salivating, unconditioned response. So there's no learning that's taken place. This is a reflex, all right? So that's normal, that's expected. It's just going to happen. I mean, if you have dry mouth and you put a piece of food on your tongue, you'll start to produce saliva, right? Everybody knows that. Okay? You've all experienced it. Now, you pair some neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, and eventually over time this turns into a conditioned stimulus or a learned stimulus. So initially for Pavlov, it was really just simply him, the sound of his footsteps or the sight of Pavlov. And so they associated him with the food. He's the bringer of the food. I mean, how many of you guys are the bringers of the food for your pets? And they know this. And they know where you keep the food. Sometimes the sound of the cupboard opening, they've associated it, right? We have a cat and we put the food in a barrel, an airtight barrel, and it makes a whirring sound when you open it. She could be asleep upstairs and she'll come running down when she hears that barrel open. You know, is she so clever? Well, you know, she's cute and clever and manipulative, but she's really learned it through classical conditioning. She's come to associate that sound with food. So it becomes a conditioned stimulus. So what initially is a neutral, meaningless thing, the sound of this sound of my cat food barrel, becomes it's a learned stimulus, the sound, and then the learned response or conditioned response would be her running down. Okay? Or in the case of Pavlov's dogs, he then introduced neutral stimuli and taught the dog that this meant food. So he would ring the bell. Okay? So it's real important that you ring the bell, or whatever that neutral stimulus is, right before presenting the unconditioned stimulus. Because if you present the food, the bell is sort of pointless. Like, who cares about the bell? Dog's eating. He's not going to pay attention to the bell. He's not going to make an association. You ring the bell right before presenting the food, then he makes a connection. That sound means food. So after some paired trials, then you can remove the food, just ring the bell. So now the bell becomes a conditioned stimulus, and the dog will salivate. It's filling up his test tube. Or you open your barrel and the cat comes running down, right? You could have an empty barrel. You keep doing that. What will happen over time, at first it works. First the dog will salivate, you know, without any food. You go a certain amount of time without giving them that actual real stimulus, the food, the behavior will extinguish. So if you move your food for your pet, you put it in a different location, he's going to keep coming when he hears that sound. Here's that certain cupboard open. He's going to keep coming and run, come down. But after a while of not getting food, he's going to unlearn the behavior, so it's going to be extinguished, and he'll stop responding. Okay. So I have this funny example of Dwight becoming classically conditioned. Dwight doesn't know what just happened. He just got trained, and he has no idea. He's actually has a physiological response. That's what's funny about the end line there is why does my mouth taste so bad? He doesn't know that learning has occurred. He has no idea that this just happened to him. And so we have these experiences all the time where we have really bodily reactions, visceral reactions. Has anybody ever gotten food poisoning at a restaurant? No one here? Okay, so you've got, so let's say, well, you don't need to tell us what restaurant you got sick from, but let's say it's that really popular one with the big golden arches. I don't need to say what it's called. Okay, so you get food poisoning there, you get really sick, and it's a week later, and your friend says, hey, let's go pick up some lunch, and you go, oh, no, I don't want to go there. The idea of it is repulsive, right? Now, if you are really classically conditioned, even just driving past and seeing the golden arches, you see the sign, and your stomach turns. It's like, and it's not imaginary. This is real. Like, you are really having a visceral, physical response. You're going, and you feel nauseous. We would say you are classically conditioned to be just repulsed. You feel, you're not throwing up like you did the night you got food poisoning, but you're having a similar physiological response. And now if you really don't know, sometimes we get these reactions and you feel some sensation in your body and you're not quite sure why. And then kind of like Dwight, he doesn't know why his mouth tastes bad. And then maybe you think about it a little bit and go, oh, that's because that's that place where I got sick, or that's that place where, maybe it's you got in a car accident in a certain area of the neighborhood, and so then every time you drive past that place, you get really anxious. And it's a real physiological response. Your body has learned something, made an association there, and so we have this real response. And so it kind of unknowingly happens to us. We are being shaped constantly through our experiences in our environment. So we'll take a closer look here. Look at this picture of the dogs. Okay, so a bell doesn't mean anything to a dog when it's not paired with anything. So we call it a neutral stimulus, right? Then, a natural reflex, like food in the mouth, that's the unconditioned stimulus, is going to have this natural response, unconditioned response, or unconditioned reflex. Luckily, it starts with the same letter, so it doesn't really matter what we call it. So it's just totally happening on its own. No learning has taken place yet. So again, unconditioned means unlearned. It's just happening. Now you pair the bell just before that unconditioned stimulus, and at first it's still a natural reflex. You're still getting an unconditioned response until the organism comes to associate and anticipate this thing to happen, the unconditioned stimulus to happen. So then you could remove the unconditioned stimulus, get rid of the food, just present the conditioned stimulus. So now learning has occurred, he's got an association, he hears the bell, conditioned response or conditioned reflex, and salivates. But if you just keep ringing the bell, and now 3-4 days have gone by and you haven't fed the dog when you ring the bell, the behavior will extinguish eventually. Okay? So if you accidentally, it's kind of good and bad, right? It's bad if you want to keep getting the response, like if you're training your dog to do tricks or something. But it's bad. It's bad if you. It's bad. So it's bad if you want them to keep doing it. But this is good news if they have learned a behavior that you want to get rid of. Like they're doing something naughty, like scratching up your couch or something, and you're like, oh my gosh, I accidentally trained him to do this, then you can stop giving a response, and then hopefully the behavior will extinguish. Right? Hopefully that made sense. Okay, and so Pavlov was a Russian physiologist, not a psychologist, but he wrote this up in the Journal of Nature. And this was, in the early 20th century. And it gets published. And we've got some psychologists that are reading it. And they're saying, wow, this is pretty interesting stuff. This can apply to humans. I think we can test this out on humans. And so then that's what we got to, hold on a second, we lost our clicker. Oh, I've got too much stuff up. Here it is. Okay, let's practice a couple, and then we'll talk about the American psychologist John B. Watson. Fred has a fluffy down pillow with some of the down sticking out of the fabric. When he first tries out the pillow, a piece of down tickles his nose and he sneezes. This happens every time he goes to bed. Soon he sneezes on every time he lays down on any kind of pillow. What's the unconditioned stimulus? Three, two, one. Okay, so some of you are getting it there. All right, so unconditioned means unlearned. It's the thing that's the stimulus, the thing that's happening to him. So it's going to be the fluffy down. Right? So what is, oops, what happened to my, uh-oh. I think I have too many things open. Too many programs running.